What I'm going to talk about today is why the Democrats really lost, and it's not what you think. There's obviously been a lot of angst and a lot of finger pointing and blame and all the things you would expect, after such a crushing loss. A lot of the debates that I've seen people having are these kind of style versus substance debates, right? And so a style side of the debate might say, we should have just picked a more charismatic candidate. We should have picked a candidate with broader appeal. And then the substance argument, to the extent that they get into it, might say, we ignored some key policy issues, so we didn't do anything about the border. And to people from outside the US, I'm just going to put some numbers against this. So during the Obama years, the number of border encounters recorded, which means border patrol running into migrants crossing the border illegally. It was typically ran at about 500,000 a year, and there was already a lot of people that thought that that was too many and that was a lot. And under Biden, that's exploded to 2 million encounters a year. I have no idea how many encounters you have to have sort of per person who actually manages to sneak across. But, if you were to assume that they only encounter 20% of the migrants and 80% of them just make it across without anyone seeing them, which I have no idea if that's true or not. But if that was true, that would mean 10 million illegal border crossings a year, up from, I guess, 2.5 during the million a year during the Obama years. So the substance argument would go something like this. You didn't do anything about the border. The electorate was really mad about the border. Even Latinos who worked hard to get their green card and come here legally are angry at the level of illegal immigration because it puts sort of downward pressure on blue-collar wages. And so even if you're a third-generation Mexican, you probably don't speak Mexican anymore. You think of yourself as an American. You've probably done quite well for yourself here. You don't necessarily want more people coming from Mexico. And even if you do, you certainly don't want them crossing illegally in their millions. So that's the kind of the substance argument. Is like, we got the policy wrong. And the style argument is, our candidate wasn't that great. We flubbed the messaging. Let's just have someone with better hair, and better looking, whatever it is, right? And to a certain extent, both of these things are true, but to a certain extent, both of these things miss the point. Yeah, so having got it right, I want to talk about why I saw this coming and why even now the Democrats don't really understand what the problem is with their party. And the best way to summarize it is to use a paraphrase from the technology industry. And that's to say it's a feature, not a bug. So the poor policies that got them in a pickle with the American people, the poor candidates that they've been running, specifically Harris and Walz, the poor process that led to selecting those candidates, all of those are not just happenstance things that can be easily corrected for next time. They're actually fundamental features of how the Democrats are currently structured. And so they're not going to be able to get out of this very easily or in any kind of a hurry. Most of them still do not understand just how broken the philosophical underpinnings of their party are, and just how much the electorate is starting to move on from them. And the most telling thing here is how many minority voters they lost this time versus 2020, right? Their whole premise was that Donald Trump was a racist and you couldn't possibly vote for him. Oh, and also a fascist. But they would oscillate between calling him a fascist and calling him a racist. And they got a real problem with that now, because it wasn't just a lot of white people who said, I'm sick of hearing this, but it was a lot of minorities who said, I'm sick of hearing this. I don't care what you think of this guy. It's not that important to me. Either I don't believe you that he's a racist, or, I think his racism, in whatever level it exists, isn't a problem for me personally, and I have more to gain than to lose from this situation. And it, probably from voter to voter, it differs in terms of how they thought of those things. But it's a real problem for the Democrats. Basically, the whole concept that underpins this party is this notion of intersectionality, where the more boxes you check on this sort of punch list of oppressed people, the more status or virtue you have within the party, and the more you deserve to have the government essentially come and help you out and address the systematic biases and inequalities that you're up against. And that whole notion was just sort of roundly rejected. And I think partly it was roundly rejected because in this theoretical framework, you've got a white man who was born as a man, but now he wants to transition to being a woman, who lives in San Francisco, and you've got an African-American 50-year-old traditional church-going family man who works in an auto plant in Georgia and is a union guy, and you're trying to convince these two people that the best political path for them is to care deeply about each other and each other's concerns, and you have to really sort of, so if you're the auto worker, to be a good, loyal Democrat, you really have to care about this man who wants to have a sex change. And if you're the man having a sex change, we need you to care really deeply about this auto worker who's 50 years old and goes to church and is actually quite conservative on the other side of the country. And at a certain point, it's like, well, what policies can you come up with? Actual practical policies that can appeal to both of these groups at the same time. And it turns out there probably aren't any, right? And even if there are, it all gets lost in the mist of this really sort of complicated, who's more oppressed? It sort of becomes a competition, who's been oppressed more, and the more you're oppressed, the more virtue you have. And this really reached its apotheosis on October the 7th, when Hamas sent, we don't really know how many, but several thousand people into the surrounding areas of Israel to commit some of the most heinous acts of sort of, murder, sex crimes, kidnapping, torture, all kinds of horrors were unleashed. And a big chunk, not the whole, but a big chunk of the Democratic Party took out their intersectional handbook and said, well, they're oppressed for the following 9 reasons. So in our framework, this is a high virtue group that is reacting with rightness indignation to their oppression. And so we're actually going to look past all the horrors that this group committed. And even before there was a significant response from the state of Israel, as we all knew there would be, kind of come out and sort of condemn the Israeli colonial oppressors and pronounce the Palestinians not only justified but virtuous in these acts that, frankly, it's hard to find a precedent for something that heinous in recent living memory. In terms of the sort of scale of destruction and the sort of bestiality and the brutality of what happened and the level of cruelty that was exhibited on that day, I hate to compare atrocities, but you could make an argument that, you know, in American terms, it was in some ways it was kind of worse than 9/11, and 9/11 was terrible, and it led to all kinds of terrible outcomes, obviously. But I think for the Israelis, they felt like, well, this is as bad, if not worse, because of the 9/11 was a horrific act, but it was kind of impersonal. What happened on October the 7th was a bunch of very personal, up-close acts of barbarism, torture, murder, sexual assault, like all these things. But a big chunk of the Democratic Party reacted to this by saying, well, they're very oppressed. And so because they're very oppressed and because they're like oppressed doubly, triply, quadruply in our sort of framework of oppression, they're inherently virtuous. And so the acts that they committed, we don't necessarily view those acts as being evil because they clearly they're virtuous. A priori, they're virtuous because they're a virtuous group. And of course, that started to tear the Democratic coalition apart. I think intersectionality as a concept was starting to fall apart, but October 7th really just ripped it to shreds, because part of the American Democratic Party concept of intersectionality required all minority groups to come together in a sort of mutual aid and mutual support. And that included, you know, over 90% of the Jews in America and over 90% of the Muslims in America. And they'd coexisted, as I mentioned in my previous video, they kind of coexisted inside this coalition for a long time. And October the 7th just made that untenable. So in a really brutal, violent and heinous way, the I don't know what to call it, you know, the nonsensicalness, if that's a word, of this concept of intersectionality was kind of put on display. And it wasn't just put on display one time for a moment, but it led to, you know, campus protests and Democrat versus Democrat conflict, right? The left wing of the party in conflict with the centrists who were saying, well, America's always supported the state of Israel. We've always supported the state of Israel's, you know, right to exist. And the left wing of the party was saying, at a minimum, we should cut off all support for Israel, and at a maximum, we should disavow their right to exist, and we should view them as sort of colonial invaders, and we should allow the Arabs to kind of get them out of there by kind of cutting them off, right? And so I don't think that was the only way that intersectionality kind of fell apart as a philosophy and as a coalition building system. But it was the most graphic and horrendous way. And I do think it massively accelerated the rate of decay, you know, within the democratic system. So in the future, the question sort of becomes, well, if this is not what the Democrats stand for, then what, right? And you saw Harris trying to figure this out with her I grew up middle class answer. You could kind of see she only had 100 days to run this campaign, and you could see that she kind of went into it knowing that this was a problem. Like, I actually give her a lot of credit for being pretty smart about this, because they kind of asked themselves the question, well, like if our intersectional model is kind of falling apart because it turns out we're putting all these groups together and they, at best, they have nothing in common, like the trans guy from California and the auto plant worker from Georgia. They have nothing in common. They don't hate each other. But then after October 7th in Israel, you've got literally two groups within your intersectional coalition who actively actually hate each other now, or certainly some members of them do. You know, and even if they don't hate each other, they view each other with suspicion. So you could see Harris saying, well, like, we got to figure out, we're not ready to completely abandon identity politics, but we need to create this big identity again and sort of reach out to that. And so it was this sort of concept of the American middle class, but it was, frankly, it was painted on by Kamala Harris and her team in 100 days. And they, I think the reason why her other message was like turning the page, and you can imagine the meetings that they had to get to this point, and I'm just thinking about it now. I can so see how they got there, right? They're like, intersectionality's collapsing in a flaming dumpster fire of Palestinian and Israeli flags. It's not working for us anymore. Okay, we're going to go back to our roots. We're going to go back to this idea of the middle class. Okay, great. The problem is that that's not really where they'd been for years. So they had to get there in 100 days. And so they came up with this tagline, turning the page, which the Republicans kind of made fun of it, because they're like, well, wait a minute, you're the party that's been in power for 4 years. How are you running as the candidate of change with this line of turning the page? Like, literally, like, how does that make sense, right? And it made complete sense to the people inside the Harris campaign, because they were like, we're completely stuffed. Our whole intersectional model's falling apart. And we've got to execute the fastest political pivot in the history of any presidential election, because our candidate only has 100 days to do this. And so we're going to give you two messages. One is middle class, and two is turning the page. I can see how they got there. Too little, too late. I think deep down they probably knew they were stuffed. And the fact that the middle class thing kept coming up and the turning the page thing kept coming up, it's like an incumbent vice president is running as a candidate of change and moving away from where we've been. Like, that doesn't even begin to make any sense unless you know you're stuffed and it's a Hail Mary. And so I think that's what happened. So in future videos, I'm going to talk about, you know, what the future looks like. Less so for the Democratic Party. I'm less interested in, and frankly, I can't really predict where they're going to go next, but more so for the country. So this was kind of my post-mortem episode of doing this. I don't want to wallow in post-mortems. So the next video that I'm going to do is going to be about what I think the next 1, 2, 3, and 4 years hold in store for us. And just as I generally don't toe the typical party line of the Democrats, as you can tell by listening to this video, I certainly don't toe the typical party line of the Republicans either. So I'm going to give you my honest, best analysis of what I think is coming down the pike at us as Americans, but also globally to my friends back in England and Europe and places I was from earlier in my life. Try and talk about what I think is happening and what I think the implications are for America and the world. So I look forward to sharing that with you soon. Because I'm going to do this regularly from now on. I'm going to do that thing that I never have done before and ask you to hit the like and subscribe button so I can start to get a sense of what content people do and don't prefer. So I'd really appreciate it if you could do that. It's just going to help me if I'm going to invest my time and energy in doing this, you know, probably twice a month, maybe as much as once a week. I want to at least know what content people want, and obviously feel free to drop me a comment, disagree with me, agree with me, ask for clarification on any points. I'm happy to talk more about any of this. All right, thanks for listening.